You know, everything we do online, it leaves a trace, a permanent, searchable record of our thoughts, our curiosities, our desires. But what happens when that secret, hidden world crashes headfirst into the real one? When our digital fantasies meet the cold, hard reality of the law? Well, that's what we're digging into today.
And let's be clear, this wasn't just another data breach. No, this was like ripping the roof off the private lives of millions of people all at once. That line between private fantasy and public knowledge, poof, it was gone. And the fallout was immediate. Careers, marriages, entire lives were turned upside down. So what exactly was in that data? What did we find out? Well, it gave us this incredible, almost shocking peek into a hidden universe of desire. We got to see what millions of people were really looking for when they thought no one was watching.
And what we saw was, well, a huge range. You had things you might expect, right? Stuff like blindfolding or using sex toys. But then you had more niche things like erotic tickling. And even stuff that sounds pretty tame, like a bubble bath for two. It just goes to show you, our digital desires aren't simple. They're this incredibly complex spectrum. And for a whole lot of people, the internet was the only place they felt they could explore any of it.
Okay, so to really get a handle on this, we need to look at how this universe of desire is actually packaged up and consumed. So let's break down the kinds of content out there and get some key terms straight.
So market research from a firm called Juniper basically says it boils down to three main types. First, you've got images, pictures, GIFs, that sort of thing. Then there's the big one, video. We're talking streaming sites, live webcams, all the stuff that really blew up once we all got fast internet. And finally, you've still got text-based stuff, like those premium SMS chats, even though that's kind of fading out.
Now, a word you hear a lot when talking about this stuff is kink. And really, all it is a catch-all term for any sexual taste or practice that's a bit unconventional. It's not about judging it, it's just a handy way to talk about all the different themes you find online. And when you look at kink, you start to see some common themes pop up over and over again. You've got exhibitionism, which is the desire to be seen, and its flip side, voyeurism, the desire to watch. Then there are all the power dynamics, like dominance and submission. Fantasies about group sex, sexual role play. These are some of the big ones.
And this quote right here, it just nails that feeling of observation, doesn't it? It gets right to the heart of voyeurism, that thrill of secretly watching, making someone else's private moment your spectacle. And that feeling is a huge, huge driver of digital content.
Okay, but how does this all become a business? Because you can bet that where there's desire on this scale, there's an industry ready to cash in. This stuff doesn't just appear out of nowhere. There's a whole complex machine built to create, deliver, and get paid for these fantasies.
All right, take a look at this. This chart basically shows you the whole journey. It all starts over on the left with a content creator. From there, their work goes through some kind of distribution platform, could be its own website, could be a network of affiliates. Then it gets handled for billing and all that before it finally lands with you, the end user. It's actually a pretty slick supply chain when you think about it.
So how do they actually make money? Well, the old school way was per event billing. You pay for one video, one picture, but now the whole industry has pretty much moved to subscriptions. Seriously, just think of it like Netflix, but for adult content. It gives them steady, recurring money, and it's totally taken over, especially with live webcams. But it's not all smooth sailing for this industry. A huge problem they face is just getting the content to people. The big gatekeepers, think Apple's App Store, have a zero-tolerance policy for what they call overtly sexual content. So what does the industry do? They've had to get creative, building their own app stores, their own platforms, completely separate from the mainstream.
But here's the thing. When you build a whole industry to cater to every single niche desire, you start to push boundaries. And this is where things get really complicated. What happens when the fantasy isn't a bubble bath for two? What happens when it's violent, disturbing, incredibly detailed? And what happens when the police get their hands on it? This is the moment fantasy itself goes on trial.
Think about it. Can you actually be thrown in jail for what you think? It's a wild question, but it's exactly what the courts had to grapple with in the truly shocking case of Gilberto Valle, who the tabloids dubbed the cannibal cop.
Now, the case against Valle, it was pretty much built entirely on his online chat logs. And we're not talking about vague daydreams here. These were incredibly graphic, detailed conversations about kidnapping, torturing, and eating women. Women he knew in real life. His wife was one of them. The stuff he wrote was just stomach-turning.
From the prosecution's perspective, this was way past fantasy. They argued these were real, concrete plans. I mean, he was talking about specific women, specific methods. He even set a date for a Labor Day cookout where one of his victims was supposed to be the main dish. For them, that was it. That was the line. He'd crossed over from just thinking into criminal conspiracy.
But his defense team, they told a completely different story. They said, look, there's a huge gap between what he was typing and what he was doing in the real world, which was nothing. They argued he was just lost in this dark fantasy world. He was lying all the time in these chats. He never once mentioned he was a cop with a gun. And every time one of his so-called deadlines came up, nothing happened. He never did a thing.
And here's the twist. The jury, they convicted him. But then, in a pretty stunning move, a judge overturned the main conviction on appeal. The court basically ruled that, yeah, his thoughts were horrifying, but he had only ever taken mental steps, not real ones. In the eyes of the law, his sick fantasy was just that, a fantasy.
So, the Cannibal Cobb case leaves us with this massive, thorny question for our digital world. How on earth do we protect something as fundamental as freedom of thought while also stopping real, actual harm that begins with a few keystrokes?
Because let's be real, the harm can be very, very tangible. Take something like sextortion. That's not a fantasy. That's a straight-up crime where someone's digital expression is used like a weapon to blackmail and hurt people. We're talking serious psychological and financial damage. In cases like that, the line is crystal clear.
But often, law enforcement is driven by this fear of a spillover effect, this idea that a dark fantasy is bound to become a real crime. And you can see that fear in the numbers. Just look at this. Between 2000 and 2006, arrests from undercover stings where cops posed as kids went up by 381%. The system is often set up to try and lure that online talk into a real-world action, which basically turns the fantasy into the crime.
And yet, all of that runs headfirst into one of the most basic ideas of a free society. The U.S. Supreme Court has said it plainly. The government can't police what's inside your head. You're allowed to have ugly thoughts. The million-dollar question is, where does that protected thought stop and a crime you can be punished for actually begin?
The internet has created this permanent searchable archive of, well, everything we desire. It's our collective id, right out there in the open. And as we all try to figure out this new reality, the big challenge isn't going away. How do we tell the difference between a dangerous plot and just a dark fantasy? Between a criminal who needs to be stopped and a citizen who just has a free and maybe disturbing mind? That line is a whole lot blurrier than any of us are comfortable with.